Okay, so this is basically a companion piece to the presentation I made yesterday. And originally I was thinking maybe I would try to include both of them in the same talk, but I don't think I could have crammed it all into a single hour. So it's actually probably better that that it was split up like that. But yesterday we talked about the foil, the so-called Roswell memory foil, and in this talk I'm going to introduce new data, which I actually think has probably not been discussed in public before, regarding fibers that I think also have exotic properties. This is called angel hair, which is not to be confused with the term that is often seen in the classic UFO literature, meaning a fibrous material that sometimes appears in the vicinity of UFO sightings and oftentimes, falls down and persists for some period of time and then evaporates. This is a different use of that term, so please don't be confused. And actually, this comes out of the story that's told in the recent book by Jacques Bally and Paula Harris, Trinity. So this is material that's related to that story, but has never been told, was not told in the story in exactly this form. And as I said, I think this is probably the first public airing of this. So just to briefly recap, little town of San Antonio, New Mexico, August 16th, 1945. Excuse me. Or I would say nearby that town, which also happens to be about roughly 25 miles away from the Trinity site, which was the location for the first testing of the atomic bomb, which of course at that time was still highly classified and secret. At that particular time, most of the adult men of the U.S. population were away contributing to the war effort in some form or another, either in uniform or working in defense industry or whatever. And so a lot of the labor that was needed on the home front was actually taken care of by children and underage, the underage population that was not off to war. So in this case, Jose Padilla, who was basically the primary witness, was out helping out on the family's cattle ranch together with his friend Reme Baca, and on this particular day. And they were basically being young cowboys. They were riding along the fences to keep the fences repaired, locating all the cattle, rescuing any cattle that were in distress or something. And so they're basically just being cowboys. And near the middle of the day, they both were sheltering from a rainstorm and heard a crash, a very loud crash that seemed to originate from about a half a mile away from where they were. And so they turned to look in that direction, and they could see smoke rising from what appeared to be the impact site or the origin of that crash. So they saddled up their horses and rode over to that site, and they discovered that it was there was a damaged radio beacon tower at the site, and a small field of debris that was scattered near the base of it, and the sagebrush and small trees were on fire, and that was the source of the smoke. And when they arrived at the site and started searching, they noticed a large amount of a white, wispy sort of fibrous material that was scattered in the brush and kind of sticking to the leaves, and in some cases being blown by the wind. They then went on to investigate the location where the bulk of the craft or the object had ended up, and within a day or two, they returned to the site with some large cloth sacks and collected as much of this material as they could, and took it home with them. And eventually, within their family lore, this material came to be called angel hair. And as I said, the more complete story is in the Trinity book by Vallée and Harris. So again, here are sort of the main characteristics that were reported. They were reported as thin, silky fibers, roughly the diameter of a human hair, which I will note in passing is actually quite a bit larger than a typical fiberglass fiber. The fiberglass fibers that are commonly used to reinforce plastics are basically gain most of their strength the smaller they are, the smaller in diameter, and so a fiber that's roughly the diameter of a human hair is probably larger than would be needed for fiber reinforcement of plastics or that kind of application. The fibers would not tangle, even though you could have a bunch of them together. They would not cross or tangle or anything. And again, to me, that kind of suggested that, well, maybe they have some force system of forces on the surfaces that prevent them from wanting to touch each other. One of the more striking characteristics was that the fibers were described as basically self-luminescent. At this particular time and in this particular location, this family lived basically in an adobe building, literally adobe block building with no indoor plumbing and no electricity and no running water. They basically were not connected to the grid at that time in that location. So basically, whenever you went into a room, unless the window was opened or it was daylight, the rooms were dark most of the time. The light that these gave off was described as by both witnesses was very beautiful, like colors of the rainbow. Again, as with the the Roswell memory foil, the fibers at one time or another were suggested to high heat to see if they could melt or burn or whatever. Because this occurred on what was basically an operational cattle ranch, they had a maintenance shop located there, which they used to keep things repaired, and so they had access to an oxyacetylene torch, and Jose himself attempted to, melt it or otherwise alter it, and could not do so. So it has that in common with the so-called memory foil. The other interesting characteristic that I have never seen reported anywhere else in the UFO literature is the claim that when the fibers would come in very close contact with the skin, like holding it in your palm, it caused pain. It caused a sensation of pain, which was described as something like the pins and needles effect that you get when maybe your hand goes to sleep and it's waking up, and you get that pins and needles effect, and also described it as like a pinch. And they both described it as it would occur when you held it in close proximity to your skin, but as soon as you took it away, the sensation would also go away. So it was entirely transient and not in any way permanently damaging. Okay, well, what happened to the angel hair? And I guess let me just point out here off to the side. Well, let me go with the text first. So initially, as I said, they had collected several bags of this material, and they hid it away because initially, within the first days and weeks after this event, the U.S. military was on the site and was searching their property, searching their houses, looking for anything that might have been related to this incident, that they would take away. They just like in the Roswell case, they wanted to remove any evidence that might indicate that something unusual had happened. But as time went by and the incident kind of faded in the past, they eventually started taking this material out and sharing it with family, friends, neighbors, people who live nearby, and basically it's just sort of the natural curiosity. What is this stuff? We don't know what it is, and so they would just kind of start sharing it. And interestingly enough, it ended up becoming utilized as Christmas orientation, which because it glowed and because it was very beautiful, and so it was used as for window decorations or Christmas tree decorations. And there is actually I looked into the sort of the history of that, and industrial processes for producing glass fiber in industrial quantities goes back actually to the late 1800s, and by the 1920s and 30s, it could be produced in routinely in large, industrial quantities. And just prior to World War II, it was starting to be used for the fiber reinforcement of structural plastics, with what today we call fiberglass, and was actually used in the war effort in aircraft and ships and things like that. In Germany, they actually had a tradition of utilizing this stuff for Christmas decorations from before World War II. And here's a picture of you can still buy some of this stuff on eBay that was manufactured back in the old days. In German, it was called Fienhaar, which I guess means like fairy hair or perhaps angel hair, and oops, excuse me, and this photo is from the 1950s, I think, and probably in the U.S. Shows this kind of material being used as Christmas decorations. And I was born in 1947, and I can remember by the time I was about 5 years old, we were using this material in my household for Christmas decorations, and so I can remember it, very distinctly. The interesting thing is that during World War II in the U.S., I believe all of the production of glass fiber was taken and used for the war effort. I don't believe there was any. I don't believe any of it made its way into the civilian consumer world. And so in the U.S., it wasn't until some years after the war, in the 1950s, that this material became popular for use as Christmas decorations. So in the U.S., it's really, from the 1950s onward is when this became popular, and eventually it stopped being used because, of course, raw fiberglass generates small shards very easily and gets stuck in your skin and becomes an irritant and so forth. But nevertheless, I can distinctly remember having this around probably in the early 1950s. Okay, so so what happened to it? Well, over time, as I said, much of it was given to neighbors and friends and so forth, and never came back. Was never accounted for. The bulk of it that was retained by Jose Padilla and his family was eventually lost in a house fire. The family house later caught on fire. This was not the adobe house, but this was a wood framed house. Caught on fire, and basically everything was lost. So there doesn't seem to be any obvious way to trace any of this today to the New Mexico site. However, a small sample of it was retained by the niece of Jose, and she took it with her when she moved to the Los Angeles, California area, and because she had actually played with it as a child, and but again, over the years, that sample was eventually misplaced and cannot be accounted for today. So all of the obvious paths for trying to track this down seem to lead into a dead end right now. However, both Jose and his niece, Jose, testified to me personally. I've talked to him many times, visited him many times, that he did in fact test it with this acetylene torch, and both Jose and his niece testified to this self-luminosity and to this so-called pinch effect. Okay, so of all that, of all those characteristics, I got interested first in this whole characteristic of self-luminance and all these beautiful colors of the rainbow, and you know, what is that all about? So after thinking about it, I considered sort of the obvious explanations, like perhaps it was radioactive and it was, you know, stimulating phosphorescence or fluorescence or something like that. But those light sources have narrow frequency bands because they're basically, you know, you're elevating an electron in an atom somewhere to some excited state, and it reverts back to the ground state, and it will emit light of a specific, you know, frequency, and it's a discrete, you know, color. If you've ever looked at a you know, your classical cathode ray tube, that's what you see. It's a characteristic color. So that did not seem to explain the sort of rainbow effect. And so when you think about a rainbow, in my opinion, I sort of immediately jumped to black body radiation, which has a components of all different wavelengths. So with that in mind, I looked at whether or not I could interrogate these witnesses with some kind of line of questioning that would reveal some of the physics of what might be going on here. And so I started digging into the you know, the human perception of color, ranges of color. And not that I'm an expert in this, but here's sort of the basic story. And I assume you can see the cursor here, right? Everybody, the arrow. Okay, so over here we have this graphic here represents essentially the power spectral distribution of black body radiation as a function of temperature, and these are the, you know, the classic black body curves, and what you see is that for different temperatures, at higher and higher temperatures, the distribution becomes more and more peaked, and the peak, you know, will actually shift in wavelength as a function of the temperature. Also, of course, the total power output goes like e to the fourth, and so the total power output also is going to increase as the temperature gets hotter. This little rectangular region here represents the portion of the wavelength of the spectrum that is accessible to the human eye. So anything within this band, your eye could see, and what you notice is that as the temperature rises, the amount of power in any particular wavelength, you know, starts shifting to the left, and so as the intensity of the black body radiation gets higher and higher at higher temperatures, it shifts from the red more toward the blue end of the spectrum. Over here, we have a representation of the response function of the human eye, and basically there are three bands because there are three different kind of receptors in the eye, and each one has its own response function, and each one, you know, peaks at likewise at a different wavelength, a different frequency. So for the human perception of color, or a range of colors, you have to basically convolve the power spectral distribution of the source that's emitting, and then you have to convolve that with the transfer function of the receptors of the eye in this case, and then you're able to compute for any given temperature, let's say, you can compute what the mix of colors would be that the human eye would perceive for that case. And that's captured in this lower graphic here, which is called a Planckian locus. And the way this works is that as the temperature gets hotter and hotter, as the color temperature of the source gets hotter and hotter, you move along this line, and the range of colors that the human eye would perceive is basically indicated by this line that's perpendicular to this locus, and so that represents kind of the mix of colors that one would perceive for any particular given black body radiation. So the experiment that I did was to take both witnesses and show them one of these Planckian loci and ask them to locate the location on this curve that best represented the colors that they were seeing. And I did this independently. I approached each one of the witnesses independently, actually over a period of about a year and a half. And so this one is where Jose put the dot, and you can see that it's somewhere between 5,000 Kelvin and 6,000 Kelvin. Color temperature probably a little bit closer to the 6,000. And here's what Jose's niece indicated. You can see also it's basically on the 6,000 Kelvin line, and by the way, there's a lot of variability in each human for the range that you can see, but the sort of the bottom line here is that they both independently located the color temperature as being around 6,000 Kelvin. They didn't know that that's what they were doing because I didn't explain any of this to them. And by the way, neither witness knows what black body radiation is. They don't know what the human eye response curves are, and they don't know what a Planckian locus is. They basically just put a dot on the curve that showed that represented sort of the best fit to what they recall, the colors that they recall seeing. So they both independently converged on essentially the same color temperature of the source. So as I said, in my opinion, the possibility that the witnesses were making this up or somehow getting together, to get their stories together, seems to me to be extremely remote. I just don't see how they would even have the information to get their stories together, even if they wanted to. So that's one element of the story that gives me a fair amount of confidence in this. Okay, so if we assume that set of observations is accurate, what's the explanation? Obviously, the internal temperature of the angel hair was not at 6,000 Kelvin. So basically, there had to be some alteration of the if it is in fact black body radiation that's been blue shifted. I mean that would be the answer. That is, it's black body radiation would give you the color distribution, and if it was blue shifted, that would make it appear to be a lot hotter than it was. So where have we heard that before? Well, from Jack, obviously. um, so, and the other thing is, so if we did in fact have this repulsive anti-gravitating field on the fibers, again, that would also explain this extreme temperature resistance. So both the acetylene torch test and the color temperature seem to be explained by this. And then I should also mention that in the story, Jose and his niece also testify to having played with small samples of the memory foil that was recovered from the crash. In particular, the niece, described it as you could fold it up like origami and then, put it on the table and it would, spontaneously unfold. So I'm kind of down to my last slide. I do see that there's a hand up. How about if I just finish this slide and then we can just go into the Q&A and we can talk about any of it. Okay, so the bottom line out of this story is that if you believe this, there were two crashes separated in time and space. One in 1945 in San Antonio, New Mexico, and another one 2 years later at Corona, New Mexico. There are each case seems to have at least one example of thin materials that appear to show this a range of anti-gravitating field on their surfaces. So the two cases are linked by the description of the memory foil, but and so that appears in both cases. However, the one case, the new case, well, it occurred in 1945, but new to the literature, introduces this idea of the foil, of the fibers, which also seems to share, a common technology. And I guess that's the pattern that I'm seeing here, is that the memory foil had these interesting and exotic characteristics, and up until this point, it was seen as a sort of a single event case. But if you accept the 1945 case as well, we now see that it's actually a specific example of a more general technology, which also includes, perhaps fibers as well. So and so I guess the question that I want to leave with, which I was hoping to get discussion on, is that the foil and the fiber both seem to operate as if there was negative mass matter engineered into the normal matter. It's the Bondi pair thing, right? The question is this qualitatively different than the large scale space-time engineering that's needed, to move these craft around, where you're able to actually, create a repulsive field in the front and, an attractive one in the other side, and you can change the orientation, you can make it, more intense or less intense, control its direction, and so on. So that's required for the large scale, Alcubierre type motion. Is that qualitatively different than this small scale effect, which seems to be unitary in its direction? It doesn't seem to be positive on one side, negative on the other. It doesn't seem to vary in intensity with time. It's just built in, like an electret or something like that. So Okay, so that's basically all I've got as prepared material. So let's go into the Q&A.